Hello and welcome to this latest version of What's Your Tonic? I'm your host Tim Phillis and I'm taking you through today's conversation about something that I've become increasingly interested in and therefore passionate about. And that is the existence of what are commonly known as blue zones. So just to introduce the concept of blue zones, they are areas that have been identified of having a disproportionately large number of people living later into life, so into their hundreds and over. Now, I'm interested in this just really to understand what learnings can we take in modern day society that we can integrate any habits or learnings into our daily routines. Now that, I think, ties in quite nicely with what is essentially the purpose of My Life Tonic. And just as a quick reminder, we want to help people, encourage people to find firstly what works for them. And a life tonic is exactly that. It's something that can help us feel stronger, more positive about our daily routine, what we're doing and how we're doing it. And what is right for some people will be different for the person that might be sitting next to you. And it can also change depending on our life stage, what we're doing, where we're living, our work or our family circumstance. So if whenever you're either reading our blogs or listening to our podcast and something doesn't quite resonate to you, I'd like to think that if it's not right now, it could well be in the future at some point. So the point and the purpose of My Life Tonic is to share different ways where we can make an impact. We can make subtle, small changes into our daily routines, dare I say habits, that if at some point in the future, this conversation, the blog, the email may just prompt you to have a think and really assess whether something's working for you or is not. What changes can you make that can help you get onto a more even keel or just make you feel more comfortable and satisfied? Ultimately, My Life Tonic is really about trying to support people's well-being. And if you've come across any of our posts or our emails or our blogs, well-being can be taken into various different ways. So there are two frameworks. I should probably not use my fingers in that way in future if you're in the UK. So there are two frameworks that I find particularly helpful. Firstly is the 5 pillars of well-being. And this will come back into the existence of blue zones, just in case you think I'm going off onto a bit of a tangent. So the 5 pillars of well-being ultimately summarize the fact that there are 5 key attributes that can affect our ongoing well-being. And so I'm not going to go into lots of detail with them now, but the first one is the fact that we are being physically active. I think that's a commonly known and accepted way to help improve both our physical and our mental health. Secondly is that we as individuals, in whatever shape or form, continue learning. That may be a new language, it might be a musical instrument, it might be doing DIY. Thirdly, we have a sense of community. And that sense of community can be a faith group, it could be a running club, it could be your place of work, it could be your family members. Then we have a sense of gifting or volunteering. And that really is a sense of that we're putting something back into the community. We're using our skills and our time to give back to a community that we're in. And then the last of the 5 pillars is one of a sense of belonging, a sense of community and all the positive impacts that can have, that ability to be comfortable within that environment, to be yourself. Now, you may start to think, well, there are 5 pillars of well-being. Some of them overlap. They certainly do. They're certainly not isolated in each of their own pillars. So you may do one activity that then crosses over to another. So for example, joining a running club, for example, or a crochet club, you're doing something you like, you might be learning new skills, but you're also having that sense of community. So in a very quick, tight nutshell, that's the 5 pillars of well-being. The second framework that I like to use that ties back to the Wellbeing Scorecard that My Life Tonic have created. And essentially there are 4 key areas. And again, not mutually exclusive, but those 4 key areas are, and there's tie over with the 5 pillars, there's that sense of community, that sense of belonging. You have lifestyle and habits, so that you're doing things in a regular way and an ongoing and repetitive way that has a positive contribution. We have our emotional and mental health, so how we maintain a positive state of mind. And then lastly, we have being physically active. So you'll see across the 5 pillars and the Wellbeing Scorecard that there are unsurprisingly similarities. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but having given you those frameworks that I find helpful and useful, how does that then relate to, finally, I'm sure you're thinking, blue zones? What are they? Where did they come from? And why are they relevant to today's society and the way in which we live? So just heading back to the identification of what blue zones are, they are initially 5 or 6 areas that were clearly shown to have a high level of people living 2 or over 100. So you had Okinawa in Japan that had that high proportion of people. You had areas in Greece and in Italy that also had those high levels. And then you also have Costa Rica. And then lastly, there was Loma Linda in California. And it may be that you think that the Californian example is a bit of an outlier. And yes, it is, but I think there are still commonalities with all of the communities that were identified in the blue zones theory. Now, as just a point and a word of warning, there are increasingly areas of analysis or critiques of the blue zones that bring into question some of the criteria and the stats that have meant some communities fall into those blue zones. And I think that's perfectly justified. I think there's always got to be a certain amount of rigor and integrity when we look at certain data. And I'll touch on those at the end. But actually, to my point, I want to really emphasize the positive commonalities that have been identified within those communities that actually remain relevant to us or not, whether the stats are slightly skewed by data collection or record keeping. I think we still have some invaluable pieces of nuggets of information to learn. You will find lots of information on blue zones. So hopefully this will just be a taster, an introduction to blue zones. And it may be that you want to watch various documentaries on various streaming channels or read other blogs. But ultimately, let this be an introduction to blue zones that hopefully might prompt some thought, may prompt some reflection in terms of what we can be doing to create habits that will help replicate some of those factors that have proved useful and relevant in blue zones. So the first of 8 different areas where there are commonalities across the areas is to move naturally. Now, we all recognize that regular exercise is good for us, but when we're talking about moving naturally, actually the emphasis is integrating the movement, the exercise, into our regular routines. So as good as going to the gym is going on regular runs, lifting weights, what these areas found was that moving naturally meant regular exercise, either walking to and from the shops. A number of these areas were also in mountainous areas, so actually just even that essence of walking to go and see friends to the shops in their daily routine in their relatively isolated areas other than the state actually meant that people were getting that exercise. And whether you're walking to the shops, whether you're gardening, that exercise is enough to keep the body going, to keep the body moving for an individual. Having a sense of purpose was also identified. Now, I love this in Okinawa. They talk about ikigai, which is really about having a sense of purpose. Your reason for being, what do you do? Why do you do it? And then is it enough to sustain the lifestyle with which you have? And people can get that purpose in many different ways. Some people might find purpose through their work, they might find it through their community, they might also find purpose through their faith, whichever that may be. But having a purpose is, why do I do what I do? What is the purpose? What is the reason for my being is important. And then there's also times for downshifting. So a period of time within the day where people can just stop and take a moment, maybe reflect, maybe have some gratitude, maybe even take a nap, so that they're not constantly going in this 24 hours, 7 days a week environment. And that may be through mindfulness activities. It might be taking time to have prayer, whichever religion you are. It might even just be having a siesta or an afternoon nap, but just giving yourself time to step away and switch off. And you may almost say that that's maybe an element of a digital detox as well. There's also the 80% rule, and we're starting to move here into habits in terms of diet and what we're eating. So the 80% rule is to have the discipline to stop when you feel 80% full. Now, I know from personal experience, sometimes that's easier said than done. But ultimately what we're trying to do is just to make sure that we're not overfeeding ourselves. Now, obviously from a dietary perspective, what we eat is equally as important. And that's the next point. In these communities, there was a high prevalence of plant-based food being eaten. Now, that's not necessarily to say that they were 100% vegetarian and they didn't eat meat. It was they ate meat on occasion rather than as a regular and integral part of their diet. And from a personalist perspective, we as a family still eat meat. What we tend to try and do is also try and eat quality meat rather than heavily processed meat. So again, we're just trying to be as healthy as we can do, and eat less quantity and more quality. Now, and again, sometimes that can be hard in our daily lives. So I've talked about quality and quantity. I've talked about eating plant-based. Now, I'm also not going to be saying thou must give up drinking, but actually it's also a sense of, if we do drink, we can have a little, and we can do it in a community-based environment. So then that helps bring people together, people around the long table, enjoying each other's company. If the food and the occasional tipples of alcohol can help bring people together, then that brings that sense of community. So I talked initially, when I talked about those constructs of the 5 pillars, we talked about that sense of community being really important. And similar to that sense of belonging. So community, belonging, getting together, maybe even being cross-generational being the last area of commonality across those communities. But having intergenerational living means that whether you're old or young, we can still have a purpose, we can have a contribution, we still feel valued and belong into that community. So I said initially or midway through this pod on blue zones, there's a lot of positive learnings to be taken. So again, just as a recap, it is about moving naturally. It's about having a sense of purpose. It's having time where we can downshift, switch off. We don't eat until we are roughly full, stop at 80%. Maybe have some plant-based or more plant-based food. Eat quality rather than quantity. And we can then also integrate that sense of community with maybe having time to meet up with family, cross-generational living, and if relevant, if appropriate, have a few drinks. So alcohol is not bad, it's just how and when we consume it. I also mentioned that there is an element of skepticism about blue zones. Firstly, in some of those areas, there were questions about the data that was collected. Were people registered as having passed away for various administrative purposes and benefits? Did the paperwork even exist? Were the data and the information that was being shared being manipulated to show these blue zones, to show or identify certain areas that had higher levels of older people living? So although we can maybe question some elements of the blue zones per se, I think, as I've highlighted in this brief episode of What's Your Tonic, I think there's still a lot we can learn. And I think also a key takeout for me is that when we're talking about blue zones, we're talking about people that have lived to a longer age. However, in modern day life, in an urban and suburban life, we can bring a lot of that into our daily routine, almost our life tonics, as we like to say. So it could be taking more exercise locally, integrating exercise into our daily routine, being mindful of what we eat, being mindful per se, whether that's through faith or just taking time out to acknowledge what you're grateful for. Maybe journaling, maybe gratitudes are a way for us to really appreciate our circumstance. And that's not to be naive to say that our circumstance will always be 100% where we want it to be, but there's also a lot of positives in our lives, that things we can be grateful for and we can build upon, and to potentially break any negative spirals of thoughts that we may have. So blue zones, if you're not familiar with them, certainly hopefully you've found this of interest and relevance. There's lots of information where you can find out more about blue zones. Maybe take the construct of blue zones, the intent that it shares, and that it shows ways that can help us lead a longer and potentially a happier life. Just be mindful that there are some questions about the existence of the blue zones. However, I think, and I truly believe, there is a lot for us to learn. Whether you're looking at it in isolation, whether you're looking at it in the framework of the 5 pillars of well-being that I shared with you at the start, and then also into the My Life Tonic Wellbeing Scorecard. And just as a reminder, the Wellbeing Scorecard is free for you to take, for you to understand a little bit more about your own personal well-being. And I'd like to think the true benefit of the scorecard is, one, it can help educate us as individuals on our overall sense of well-being, and giving ourselves a score. But then we can use it as a reference point in the future to come back, to retake that scorecard, to see if any of the small changes that we've made have made a difference. And that's where My Life Tonic looks to support people and organisations, giving people more understanding, access to small changes, habits and tips that can be introduced into our daily routine that can make a difference. And make a difference in small incremental ways. A lot of the comments or the suggestions that we make as My Life Tonic are just small tweaks within our daily routine. They don't require vast sums of money. All they really need is a little bit of time dedicated on a regular basis. And once you get into that habit, start to feel the difference over time. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me on this channel or through email. Look forward to hearing from you. I'll also put a link to the scorecard in case that's piqued your interest. So thanks for listening. Hope you found this useful, helpful, insightful. It may even be just the starting point of your own investigation into blue zones and how we can potentially integrate some of those learnings into our own lives. Thanks for watching, and hopefully see you soon on our What's Your Tonic podcast.